What we're going to do now is look at the macronutrients, and these are the energy yielding nutrients of the body. And we've talked about these already in terms of their ATP potential, but you have carbohydrates, and they're abbreviated CHO, and carbo coming from carbon and hydrates coming from water. You have proteins, which are AAs or amino acids, and then you have lipids, which are fatty acids. All these are stored because ATP is unstable, and you can't store ATP, but you store lipids and carbohydrates, and your body can use that for ATP, and your body can use protein if it's a carbohydrate and lipid deficient or high stress environment. So the first thing we're going to look at is carbohydrates, and you can see some of the carbohydrates that are depicted there, your beans and your fruit and produce, potatoes, starches. You have your vegetables, some more fruits. These include your simple sugars like honey and corn, fructose, and sugar, right? And we tend to want to say that these here are bad carbohydrates and that these here are good carbohydrates, but we're going to find that it's more complex than that. All carbohydrates are made up of the same thing. They're made up of sugar, and whether they're simple or complex, we're going to discuss that, but in the end, they're made up of the same basic, roughly 6-carbon hexagon. And you have 3 primary sugars. You have a 6-carbon ring called glucose, you have a 6-carbon ring called galactose, and you have a 5-carbon ring called fructose. And these 3 sugars make up your monosaccharides. So you have glucose, you have your galactose, which is nothing more than a reconfiguration of the glucose, and then you have this special sugar called fructose. And these 3 monosaccharides, mono meaning one, simple, they come from sunlight. So as we look at carbohydrate, you have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and water that comes from the atmosphere into the soil combined with some minerals, and with sunlight you get photosynthesis and you produce one of these 3 sugars. Glucose is by far the most abundant. Galactose is produced in avocados and a couple other green aspects, and you have fructose, which is basically in fruit sugar, but it's made in different parts of the plant. Now the plant will take this and will continue to make these based on if there's enough carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight, and we'll start to add these links or these sugars together, and you go from monosaccharides, 1, to disaccharides, which are 2. And you have glucose, which is which makes a maltose. You have glucose and fructose, which makes sucrose, which is your table sugar. Then you have your glucose and galactose, which makes lactose, which is your milk sugar. And this adding of sugars continues on until you would have trisaccharides and so forth, but anything more than 2, you get polysaccharides. And you're doing nothing more than adding glucose, making these chains, and you are complexing the molecule, and that's where complex carbohydrates come from. So your simple carbohydrates are your mono and disaccharides. Your complex carbohydrates are polysaccharides. Now there really is no limit to the length of these chains, and you can continue to add these chains on, and you get different structures and shapes. You can get relatively straight shapes called like amylases. Then you get this other shape called starch, right, which is what we refer to as our complex carbohydrate. And again, all these hexagons are representative of a 6-carbon sugar. You have starch, which is complex. That's why if you try to eat a raw potato, it's going to be disgusting and it's going to be very firm. But if you cook the potato, you're breaking these starch chains down into these amylase chains, and you're breaking those amylase chains even further, and you are able to access those sugars. We store sugar in our body as glycogen. We take small glucose chains and we complex them and store them, and the body's able to use that. The plants will take glucose and make that even more diverse and more rigid and make cellulose, so fiber. That cellulose can be linked into chains and then wrapped into ligands, and this is where you get wood. So wood is nothing more than extremely complex carbohydrate, and if you had the ability to break that down, you would be able to eat the sugar, and that's nothing more than sunlight, sugar, carbon dioxide that is edible. And so when you look at a cherry tree, everything here is made from sugar. The bark, the stems, the leaves, the cherry, the pit. The question is it as accessible to the body for digestion? And the answer is no. We can only eat the fruit part of it because it's a little bit of cellulose that's holding things together, and although we can eat it, our body really can't break it down, but we're looking for the disaccharides and monosaccharides and the starches that are there, right? In that case, mostly fructose and glucose, but nonetheless, we're breaking that down. If we were to eat the leaf of this, we wouldn't be able to access it. If we ate the leaf, we'd poop out a leaf. If we ate the bark, or we'd poop out the bark, and if we ate a stick, we might end up in the surgery for a perforated bowel because of the stick going through there because we can't break it down. Now, some animals like termites have gut bacteria, so when they eat this here, where they would eat the leaf, or in this case they would eat the wood, they have a whole army of microbiology, microbacteria that are breaking things down and accessing those sugars. When a cow or a deer eats the leaves, they're able to break that down because the transit time in their gut is slow enough. We as humans have about an 8-hour or 7-hour transit time, sometimes faster. We don't have enough time to break that down. We do break down a little bit of that, but our guts aren't designed for it. So, but again, I bring this up is that it's not what you eat, it's what you absorb, right? So if you eat grass, your body's not going to be able to break it down because the sugar chains are too complex, and we either don't have enough time or have the right biochemical and microbiological environment to do that. So you really want to think of glucose or carbohydrates as glucose chains. And so you have complex carbohydrates that are long chains, and you have simple carbohydrates that are simple chains, but the final destination of all carbohydrates is sugar, right? So sweet potatoes and cherries are going to eventually be converted to sugar. It doesn't even matter if you have celery and M&Ms. The final destination is sugar, simple carbohydrates, monosaccharides. That's the only thing that can pass through the gut are monosaccharides. And that's why I had this slide here earlier, was to show that this is the only thing these are the only carbohydrates can be absorbed: glucose, galactose, and fructose. Maybe the disaccharides can be absorbed sometimes, but it's looking to break these down in their smallest components. And so starch and fiber, they need to be converted, and that's why your body's converting potatoes to sugar, cherries to sugar, celery to sugar, M&Ms to more sugar. Even the debate between whole grains and refined processed grains, the final destination is sugar, right? And that's what your body's looking to use. It's looking for glucose, because sugar, sucrose here, is actually a disaccharide of glucose and fructose, and the body wants glucose. It wants the individual. And 1 teaspoon, like 1 spoon level, not even heaped, is about 4 grams of sugar. That's all the sugar that's floating around in your blood at any given time for a normal human adult, 70 kilograms, so 150-pound individual, right? So you might be a little bit more if you're 200 pounds and a little less if you're 120 pounds. But that's it. So 1 teaspoon of sugar, and when you look at 4 grams of sugar, you look at your soda or your pop, your Coca-Cola, it's like 43 grams of sugar, right? That's 10 times the amount of that's floating around your blood, and your body has to do something with it. And your body does do stuff with it. As we had talked about, your body stores glucose because it only keeps 4 grams within the blood, so about a teaspoon in the blood at any given time. The rest is stored. Either it's stored as glycogen, so the glucose is what the body is breaking everything down. That's what's transporting through the blood, and then the body is storing it in our tissues, just like the plants store it in their tissues. They store it as starch. We store it as glycogen. We have a limited supply of glycogen. We have about 100 grams of glucose storage in the liver, so about 400 calories, and we have 500 grams in the muscle. And recall that glucose can only be stored here, and that the glycogen stored in the muscle can only be used by that muscle. Glycogen that's stored in the liver can be distributed in the circulation and used everywhere else. Everything else, anything excess, is converted to body fat. So just recall that the liver and the muscles are the only storage site, and they're limited in their capacity. The body will keep only 4 grams, 1 teaspoon in the blood at any given time, but you have a limited, not an infinite, a limited capacity in the liver and the muscle. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the way you look at it, we have an unlimited capacity or near limitless capacity in the fat storage. So everything that you eat, whether it's sweet potato, celery, cherries, or M&Ms, is eventually going to turn into carbohydrates. Carbohydrates going to eventually turn into sugar at some point. And it's going to get into the intestines. It's going to be broken down at that point and absorbed through the microvilli into the bloodstream. And the blood's going to pick up the sugar. And this is depending upon how fast or how much you've consumed, there's going to be more glucose coming into the blood sugar, and your blood sugar levels are going to start to rise. You're going to go from arrested fasted blood sugar under 100, and eventually it's going to go up above 140. And now your body has to go to work to bring these sugar levels down under control. And this is where you get the release of insulin and other hormones, but primarily insulin. Insulin is taking sugar out of the blood and transporting it to the liver. It's going to top it off first, so you're going to get 100 grams stored there, so 400 calories. It's going to go around and top off all the stores in the muscle, And then we're left with, where does the excess go? And the excess is going to adipose tissue. You have more sugar, you're going to have more adipose tissue. And you have even more sugar and more adipose tissue, and so on and so forth. You have a limited capacity in the liver and muscle for sugar storage. You have a near limitless aspect of fat storage, and your body will develop more fat cells to accommodate the tissues, the sugar loads that are there. You'll start to get fat deposited in the liver. You'll start to get fat deposited in the subcutaneous tissue, and if you eat enough or you have high insulin environment enough, you'll start to get visceral fat inside the body cavity. And so our whole conversation here is about how do we control or modify our blood sugar levels. Every time you eat carbohydrate, there's going to be a metabolic consequence to that. There's a cause and effect. Your body vehemently defends your blood sugar levels. It wants to keep it between 70 and 140. Ideally, it keeps it below 100. And anytime it gets above that 100, it's going to start implementing strategies to bring that down. And insulin is the key hormone for that. And when insulin's released, it turns the fat cells on. It turns all the cells on for them to be input and intake only. And so when this happens enough, you start to go from a certain amount of fat tissue to this fat tissue that's accommodating increased sugar aspect, particularly the pro-inflammatory environments where you start to get hyperplasia of these adipocytes, so you get more fat tissue. Insulin is the key to fat loss. And I kind of lied to you, because when you look at glucose can when it comes into the body, it's going to be stored in these tissues. So I didn't lie there, but storage is not the only thing that happens. Your body is burning. Remember, we looked at the metabolic rate, the BMR. Biggest aspect of caloric output is your resting energy requirements. Your body at rest is in the oxidative state, and you are burning either fat or sugar in that state. And if you have an elevated blood sugar level, fat burning is going to come to a halt, and your body's going to use sugar for fuel. It's going to prioritize sugar. Insulin, when insulin levels are elevated, and that's usually because you've had an increase in blood sugar levels, fat burning, accessing that long-term sugar storage, is done. And the body's primarily using sugar for fuel because it's a medical emergency, trying to reduce the sugar aspect from that. And we'll talk more about insulin and sugar mechanisms in terms of metabolism, but keep in mind that whenever blood sugar levels are elevated from carbohydrate intake, your body stops accessing its own stored body fat and starts using the sugar that's readily available. And it's going to burn sugar over fat. So it's going to preferentially burn the carbohydrate. This has been interpreted incorrectly by many, saying that carbohydrate is the preferred fuel source. And it's not its preferred fuel source. It's required, it's obligatory, because it needs to bring blood sugar levels down. And so it doesn't worry about fat levels, it worries about the sugar levels. When we look at the summary of carbohydrates, it is a non-essential nutrient. And what I mean by that is that there are no forms of glucose or galactose, or there's no monosaccharides or disaccharides that the body absolutely needs to get in its diet. It can manufacture everything it needs. All proteins, all fats were sugars at some point, and so the body can reconvert sugars and part of the fat, the glycerol component, back into carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are non-essential. Things that come along with carbohydrate tend to be essential. So carbohydrates tend to be a big source of vitamins and minerals. And so the things that come along with that, so like fiber are such, but in terms of sugar and starches, their primary role are energy and energy only. And when we look at our carbohydrate intake, it always has an effect on our glucose levels. And when we look at foods that increase our glucose levels, we're going to have a related insulin response. And it's the insulin that we need to optimize and keep under control if we want to progress towards a low inflammatory environment, and particularly a low body fat environment. This is a little teaser. What we're going to look at is that every time you eat carbohydrate, you're going to have an insulin release, and depending upon how fast that sugar gets into the stream, so is it really complex carbohydrates, or is it very low processed, or is it very high processed, you're going to get a bigger surge. And every time that you eat, you put fat burning on halt, and your body goes into storage mode. And you can kind of see here that every time you get elevated blood sugar, you're going into fat storage, and anytime you get low blood sugar, you're going into fat burning, but then you're getting into that possible catabolic effect of lean body mass. And so it's not so much of let's not eat versus eating, you want to optimize metabolism by keeping lean body mass around, but you want to create a hypoglycemic environment where the body is forced to use fat for fuel. And this is where the basis of like intermittent fasting comes in, is that if you can start to condense your feeding windows down, you can spend more time in that fat burning state. So if we look at like our traditional 3 meals per day, you can see that the amount of red that we're in versus the amount of green that we're in, and this is not talking about total caloric intake. It's just looking at how do you time your meals so that you can optimize your physiology versus your 2 feeding windows versus your 1 feeding window. And you're putting more of the time in a hypoglycemic state where your body has to use the stored food. And when you look at most animals, unless you're a grazing animal that's looking to put on fat for the winter, you're not eating most of the time throughout the day. You're eating like once a day or every other day, and your body, 1 pound of body fat is 3,500 calories. That's more than enough to get through a day without eating. Every time you eat a highly processed or very digestible carbohydrate, you're going to get a big insulin spike, and you're going to get a following insulin crash. And insulin levels are more important than glucose levels, but insulin, as you can see here, stops the fat burning process and it stimulates fat storage. So your doors of your fat cells are one way, and when insulin is elevated, they're on intake only, not outtake. And when you look at the quality of your carbohydrate, you can start to look at like your highly processed in the red, you can look at your somewhat refined in the white, and you can see your complex, or not necessarily complex, but unprocessed in the blue. Don't confuse this as complex carbohydrates do this and simple carbohydrates do this. It's more of a processing aspect. Honey that's heated and processed will have a high blood sugar spike versus honey that's raw is going to have a more blunted response. So it's not just the complexity of it, it's also the processing. So things in their more natural state are going to have a more blunted response. Things in a highly processed are going to have a higher response. And you can kind of see the comparison here throughout the day of your meals, looking at the sugar responses from your insulin responses from processed carbohydrates versus your unprocessed carbohydrates. Now all of this starts to take in consideration these index responses, and you have what's called the glycemic index, the glycemic load, and the insulin index. And these are different measures of how a particular food affects your blood glucose levels and your insulin levels. And all three are kind of basically looking at the same thing, but they're different. So you can't compare like a glycemic index to a glycemic load and insulin index, and they have their strengths and weaknesses. But the most part, if you want to qualify your carbohydrates in good or bad, I would do so more on the physiological response to it and not on just purely simplifying this is simple carbohydrate, so that's bad. That's a complex carbohydrate, that's good. You want to kind of look at how does the body respond to that. And when you look at the glycemic index, and this is from your textbook, you can see that there's a rating here, and anything less than 55 would be considered quote unquote good, and things greater than 70 would be bad, but you're getting too much of an insulin response. And you can see the things you would expect, like your donuts and your waffles are above 100, they're actually above 70, and like your barley, your whole grains, or your apple juice being kind of on the lower end. And you can kind of look through here and see where your sugar ratings are at. So this is looking at glycemic load, and this is based on 50 grams of carbohydrate. And so realistically, you may not eat 50 grams. Like 50 grams of tomato is a lot of tomato. And whereas 50 grams of carbohydrate coming from bread is like 3 or 4 slices of bread, that's more doable. So where you have the glycemic, this is glycemic index, where you have glycemic load, is looking at more realistic aspects. I prefer the insulin index, and this is looking at from 100 calorie intake, how much does your insulin rise? And this is a complex image here. And what I would say here is at the end where you see things that are very low insulin producing, it's going to be your butter, olive oil, avocados, and walnuts. And then next comes bacon and peanut butter. And then way over here, jelly beans, right? That's your most insulin producing. In fact, if diabetics have taken too much insulin, jelly beans they use to get their blood sugar levels up right away. If they don't have jelly beans, they have just pure glucose dextrose tabs, which are pure glucose. And then you have puffed rice, like Rice Krispies, and you can see that the more processed and refined things are, the faster or bigger insulin response you're going to have. And things that are more either low carbohydrate or minimally processed, they're going to have a lower response. Now, like right here, you have Coca-Cola, and so that is processed, refined. It's right in the middle, but again, when you look at how many calories are there, it's about 120 calories. You're not getting as much insulin response. But it doesn't say that Coca-Cola, you don't look at this and say Coca-Cola is better than, I guess, Cheerios. But if you look at here, these are mostly processed grains and sweetened teas. And for some reason, the phosphorus in the acidic environment is keeping the insulin response down. And that's what's really interesting when you look at this, is that things that have either a high amount of acid, like lemon juice or vinegars, or things that have high amounts of fiber, they tend to blunt the insulin response. And so like that's why eating an apple, not so much the acidity, but in terms of the fiber aspect, is going to have, you say take that apple and you juice it, and you take that apple and you eat it. Eating the apples, you're actually going to get more carbohydrate from that apple because you're eating more of the starch, but you're going to have a lower insulin response because you have more of the fiber associated with it. Your body actually has to break that down. The mastication that occurred from chewing and breaking down in the stomach was done mechanically by the juicer. For you, when you eat that apple, it's done by your teeth and your stomach. It's a slower process, so you're not going to get a surge of carbohydrate. And so your blood response is going to look more like this when you eat the apple, but more like this when you drink the apple juice. Same apple, just one was processed and one was unrefined. So to keep that in your mind as you're looking at this, is the less that you do to it, the better physiological response you're going to have to it. Not necessarily good for all things. You might not be able to access as much of the micronutrients, but at least from a carbohydrate response, whole foods are better than processed foods. And the reason why the whole foods tend to be better is because of the presence of dietary fiber. And these are non-digestible carbohydrates, non-digestible. Not meaning that you can't eat them and they're poisonous. It means that your body can't access that. And so you have soluble and insoluble fiber, one that can mix with water and one that can't. But fibers are nothing more than complex carbohydrate chains. And they're so complex that the body might cleave maybe one or two of the glucose molecules out of there, but for the thousands that are there, it's only maybe accessing 1% of that. So these are referred to as ineffective carbohydrate. So if we look at this food label here, we have total carbohydrates listed there at 4 grams and dietary fiber at 1 gram and sugar at 1 gram. And so it's not explicit, but it's implied that you have 2 grams of starch. So out of the total 4 carbohydrates, 4 grams of carbohydrates, 1 gram is sugar, 1 gram is fiber, and what's left over is the starch. And if we look at the calorie counts for this, we look at each gram of carbohydrate is 4 calories per gram, so we have 16 total calories of carbohydrate. And if we look at to get the 20 calorie serving, that would mean that we look at 4 calories per gram, so 4 calories coming from protein and 16 calories coming from carbohydrate. So that means that each serving of this would be about 20 calories. Now the thing is that it's not really 16 calories. It's 16 calories if I were to burn this and measure the total heat output, but included in this 4 grams is 1 gram of dietary fiber, and dietary fiber is inaccessible to the human body. And so this really is 12 calories instead of 16 calories. So although it has 1 gram of fiber, that fiber is basically untapped, right? It's like you've eaten the thing, you've eaten the total potential energy that could be burned in a bomb calorie meter, but it doesn't mean that's going to be absorbed. So this is one of the big areas where if you're eating a lot of fiber, you're getting bulk and you're getting food in, you're not necessarily feeding your body. What you are doing is you're feeding the microbes that are in there and increasing the microflora. This is where they get the ineffective carbohydrate in terms of that fiber calories really don't count because, yes, you are eating them, but you're definitely not absorbing them. And if you are, it's so small that it's a small percentage of that. In summary, we look at carbohydrates. We want to look at, we want to qualify good versus bad. And our traditional perspective of this is simple versus complex. And I don't know if that's a complete aspect, right? We don't want to oversimplify things. We want to clarify things, and we might have to make things more complex. And when we look at this, we really want to look at quantity and quality of carbohydrate. And when we look at quality, we're looking at like how fast, how much insulin or fiber. And when we look at like the quantity, we're looking at not just the total amount of carbohydrates, but like what have you done, not to earn those carbohydrates, but are you going to be putting those carbohydrates back into the muscles and liver, or are you going to be storing it into fat? So basically, how much time have you spent in the glycolytic state? How much time have you spent burning sugar? And if you're an endurance athlete, you're spending a boatload of time in the glycolytic state, and so you could eat like the food guide pyramid and have 10 servings of grains per day. But if you're a sedentary individual or it's an off training day, I got to tell you that those 10 servings are probably going to store as body fat. And again, when we look at quality, we want to look at processed versus refined. Is it in a natural state, or has more of the digestion been done for you outside and now you're eating it? And I think the most important thing when it comes to carbohydrates in terms of looking at quantity versus quality is how much energy versus nutrition are you getting, right? Are you getting a whole bunch of carbohydrate, lots of starch, very little fiber, and void of any kind of nutrition, not a lot of vitamin C, vitamin D, or are you eating something that's nutrient dense, like a carrot or celery, that might not have a lot of total calories or carbohydrate, but has a whole bunch of these things here, these vitamins and minerals that are coming along with it. So again, there are no essential carbohydrates. Your body can make everything it needs. There are very little to no, I would say no structural responsibilities of carbohydrate. They're merely a vehicle for nutrients. And those nutrients are micronutrients like vitamins and minerals and fiber. And the big thing you have to consider is that carbohydrate has a insulin consequence. When you look at your blood sugar levels, carbohydrate has the strongest insulin response. Protein has an insulin response as well, and fat virtually has negligible over a long time. And you got to look at this from the furnace perspective. Do you want to be in a fat burning state or fat storing state? And carbohydrate, particularly the amount of carbohydrate that's in your blood, drives your fat metabolism. If glucose levels are elevated, thus insulin levels are elevated, fat burning comes to a halt, and your body's going to preferentially burn sugar over fat. And if your goal is fat loss, then carbohydrate modification is your goal. Reduce carbohydrate intake and increase glycolytic activity, aka high intensity.